Hi, my name is Edward Smith, and I'd like to give you a short presentation on some information that I gained through my study of second language acquisition theories. In this presentation, I would like to address some important pedagogical tools for successful instructed second language acquisition and their application in the classroom environment. A couple of points that I will be covering in my short presentation. I will be touching on Krashen's monitor theory and the development of implicit language knowledge. I will also be looking into Vygotsky's sociocultural theory and language development. I will also address structuration theory, which is a theory of Anthony Gidden's. It's actually a theory from sociology that I touched on in my English for Specific Purposes class. However, I also found that it was a very important theory for helping students develop language skills and acquire long-term language skills through genre building activities. I would then like to touch on positive and negative aspects of corrective feedback in the classroom environment, specifically the use of recasts. And I would like to finish my short presentation by touching on some implicit pedagogical approaches for an English for academic purposes environment. Stephen Krashen had many interesting ideas on the development of implicit language knowledge. Two areas that Krashen touched on that I found very interesting and I have begun to apply in my pedagogical approaches to second language instruction are his monitor theory and his natural order hypothesis. Specifically, Krashen felt that the reason instruction is not beneficial for acquisition is that the internal processes of language development are not amenable to external manipulation. So Krashen felt that language development went through developmental stages, and regardless of where you teach more advanced language grammar, language theories, that if the student is not developmentally ready for that, they will not be capable of acquiring language skills in that area. With the natural order hypothesis, as previously indicated, language acquisition follows a developmental sequence. The suggestion that Krashen gave was to provide lots of comprehensible input and to provide this input in what he termed I+1, so input plus one. So essentially to push the student one step above the level at which they fully comprehend input in order to speed up the developmental phases for language acquisition. So where I found this was very interesting for me is that I was under the assumption in my previous instruction of language that I could teach grammar in a chronological fashion and that students would be able to retain that grammar based upon what I had taught them previously. However, looking at this through the lens of Krashen's monitor theory and natural order hypothesis, it appears that regardless of how much I emphasized new grammar, students may not have fully been able to ingrain it until they had reached the proper developmental phase. Another theory touched on this class, which I found similarities to Krashen's thought process, but also some divergences from his thought process, is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory and its three stages of mediation, internalization, and the zone of proximal development. Where Krashen seemed to focus pretty heavily upon the cognitive development of a learner's process of acquisition of language skills, Vygotsky touched more so upon the social element behind the development of language skills and felt that social exchange with others was vital for the learner to develop and internalize language skills. So process of mediation, Vygotsky saw language, like many other things in human development, as a tool, and specifically as a problem-solving tool developed through the history of human activity. Over time, learners would be able to move from working with other people to develop language skills to internalize these structures and then be able to operate independently. So language exchanges, working with others, speaking in the language of the target discourse community for the purpose of ESL, EFL instruction of English language learners. Learners would need to mediate, use the language in collaborative activities, and over time, they would begin to internalize the language skills and begin to be able to use the language independently. Now here, of course, we see a bit of a contrast between Krashen, who seemed to think that not that Krashen himself would be would lack the inclination to encourage exchanges among students, but would feel that the developmental stages would need to be reached for the learner to develop long-term language skills. Here, Vygotsky has a feeling that humans being social animals, the need to exchange with one another to develop skill sets through mediation and then process of internalization, the step of internalization would be achieved. One fascinating correlation I find between the zone of proximal development and Stephen Krashen's input plus one would be the zone of proximal development, where Krashen would see that the student would have a particular input level and would try to exceed it by one to give them input that was just beyond in order to speed up the developmental phases and the developmental acquisition of language skills. Vygotsky saw the zone of proximal development as the space between independent problem-solving developments and possible level of development in collaboration with peers. So I drew the correlation here that by working in collaboration with others, one could argue that this was a bit of an application of the I+1 within sociocultural theory. So understanding the level of comprehensible input that a student had and knowing that you could push that just a little bit farther. So looking at it from the perspective of Vygotsky as a teacher, knowing what the student's zone of proximal development is, having them work with peers to develop their skill set so that they would be able to move beyond that, be able to increase the zone of their proximal development, you could say, and in collaboration with others, they would be able to move forward. Intriguingly, it doesn't necessarily have to be an expert-novice relationship in order for internalization of language to take place. Many studies that were presented in the low-end text indicate that even students working collaboratively were able to expand their understanding of the language and develop stronger language skills by working in collaboration with peers whose level was similar. Another area of English language instruction that was not specifically touched on in this course, but was touched on in my English for Specific Purposes course has to do with English for specific purposes or English for academic purposes and structuration theory. Structuration theory is a sociological theory of Anthony Gidden's, which felt that societies and subsocieties, and for our purposes, academic communities, are constituted and continually reproduced through recurring and largely taken for granted forms of behavior such as genres. For me, a lot of my teaching at an adult high school is the push to have my students emulate particular writing genres in order for them to achieve higher levels of academic success and move into high school level language arts classes. So I found structuration theory to be very helpful. A second quote from the Bostrickman text indicates that English for specific purpose learners, in order to participate in the societies they aspire to, need to know the rules of the game regarding the genre. So if I am able to provide my students with an understanding of the writing rules, how to structure 5-sentence paragraphs efficiently, I feel that I am able to provide them with the necessary structure for them to approach English in a very proficient manner for their academic needs. So I felt that structuration theory was also a very relevant theory when it came to second language acquisition. Now, whether this would be beneficial for long-term acquisition or simply learning is also debatable. However, for short-term results, for academic success, I have found it to be very useful. Another area that I have found very useful for my approach to second language instruction pertains to the application of corrective feedback, and more specifically, having realistic expectations for input, providing corrective feedback in the form of recasts. This ties into what I was considering earlier on in my presentation, considering Stephen Krashen's learning versus acquisition. So his monitor theory. Is it truly possible for the student to internalize the recast at that time? Or will they simply repeat the correction that I have provided them with, but not internalize that correction into their long-term memory for acquisition? So one criticism of recasts is they may be too implicit to notice. So again, this ties back into what I was discussing previously regarding the use of corrective feedback and questioning whether my students are truly able to acquire longer-term language skills from recasts. Another point that I'd like to address here has to do with the dangers of negative evidence, and this is something that I brought up in this course, and this applies to me personally, is that allowing students to notice the gap, I feel should be done sparingly from personal experience. In my personal study of Japanese, I was told about incorrect writing forms, and it did affect my motivation, and I felt that my affective filter was also raised due to it. So I find it's important to consider an effective humanistic approach to language instruction and sparingly provide negative evidence unless it's absolutely necessary based upon my personal experiences with negative evidence. I'd like to end my short presentation with a few pedagogical approaches to language acquisition I have used in my classroom. I have used a bit of input flood recently for some of my students who are attempting to understand connotation in literary text. I have used a bit of input flood with an inductive approach by providing them with a story, in this situation, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And after a little bit of explicit instruction on the use of connotation by examining words as to whether they have a positive or a negative connotation, I've allowed them to read the story independently and then to report back to me where they feel that connotation is present in the story. I have also used a little bit of input enhancement where I have actually written a grammatically incorrect sentence on the board and had my students identify the parts of speech, and they do notice that there are errors in the sentence, and they're able to correct the errors, which I feel has helped to reinforce an understanding of correct parts of speech. And within my approaches to English for academic purposes, I have worked a lot on genre-building writing activities that stress emulation, as I indicated previously in my presentation, where I have provided students with examples of well-constructed 5-sentence paragraphs and also alluded to 5-paragraph argumentative essays in order to give students an understanding of the rules of the game and to provide them with structure for composing competent, clear, and powerful essays that will be helpful for high school completion. A few references that I have used for this short presentation. I have used the book Ideas and Options in English for Specific Purposes by Helen Basterman, and I have also used information from Introduction to Instructed Second Language Acquisition by Sean Lowen. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed my short presentation on pedagogical approaches to instructed second language acquisition.